There's a documented psychological phenomenon that occurs when a human being is suddenly stripped of all their geographical and visual landmarks. Without the distinct line of the horizon to orient yourself, and without the distant, comforting glow of city lights to guide you, your brain literally loses its ability to judge distance, scale, and direction. You experience a profound, terrifying, dizzying vertigo. And when you experience that complete sensory loss while standing on a temporary, sinking sliver of sand in the middle of a freezing, rising ocean, absolute panic is the only logical response. I grew up in a small, relatively isolated blue-collar coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. Our beaches aren't the warm, pristine white sand paradises you see on postcards from Florida or Southern California. They are rugged, violent, and notoriously dangerous. The water here is perpetually freezing, the sand is coarse, gray, and packed hard by the rain, and the coastline is littered with massive, jagged stacks of ancient sea rocks. The shoreline is bordered by the bleached, twisted, skeletal remains of massive driftwood trees that have washed ashore during violent, churning winter storms. It's a beautiful place, but it is a landscape that demands respect because it is entirely unforgiving. When I was 22, I returned home from my university for the long winter break. It was late December. The coastal weather that year was brutal and unrelenting, a constant freezing sideways drizzle, heavy suffocating sea fog, and biting winds that cut right through your heaviest winter coat like a knife. Because of the miserable, freezing conditions, our usually bustling tourist town had morphed into a complete ghost town. The summer vacationers were long gone, the boardwalk shops were boarded up for the season, and the locals stayed locked inside their heated homes with the blinds drawn. I have always been a chronic night owl, dealing with bouts of severe insomnia. Because of this, I had developed a deeply ingrained habit of taking long, solitary walks on the beach in the middle of the night to clear my head, regardless of the weather conditions. The isolation usually brought me a sense of deep peace. It was a Tuesday night, around 1:30 a.m. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, completely unable to sleep. The tide charts, which I checked daily out of a lifelong coastal habit, indicated that we were experiencing a king tide, an exceptionally historically low tide triggered by the alignment of the moon and the sun. This massive gravitational pull pushes the ocean back much, much further than usual, exposing vast, flat expanses of the seafloor that are normally submerged under 20 feet of violent, freezing water. The temptation to walk out and explore this temporary alien landscape was completely overpowering. I knew the area intimately, and I knew the tide wasn't scheduled to reach its absolute lowest point, let alone start rushing back in, for at least another hour. I had plenty of time to explore and make it back to the dry dunes. I stepped over the line of high-tide seaweed and started walking straight out, away from the safety of the dry dunes, stepping onto the packed, wet sand of the ocean floor. The further I walked away from the land, the more profoundly isolated I felt. The sound of the howling wind whipping past my ears and the distant thunderous crashing of the ocean completely erased any ambient sounds of the sleeping town behind me. I walked for about 20 minutes, losing myself in the strange environment. I would stop to shine my heavy flashlight down into the deep, rocky tidal pools, fascinated by the bizarre, pulsating anemones and starfish that were temporarily exposed to the freezing, biting night air. I must have walked nearly half a mile straight out into the void. The distant roar of the breakers was getting significantly louder. I stopped, stretched my back, and turned around to look back at the distant glow of the town's streetlights to gauge my distance. My heart gave a sudden, hard, incredibly uncomfortable flutter in my chest. The tide. When the tide comes back in on these massive, flat Pacific sandbars, it doesn't slowly creep up the beach inch by inch like a bathtub filling up. It is a violently fast, deceptive process. It rushes in from all sides simultaneously, filling the deeper, non-seen trenches and sand channels first. This creates invisible, fast-moving rivers of freezing water that encircle you, cutting you off from the shore before you even realize you're surrounded. It's incredibly easy to drown just 50 yards from the dry beach if you get caught in a trench and the current sweeps you off your feet. "Okay, stop. Don't panic," I said aloud. My voice sounded incredibly small, flat and muffled, instantly swallowed by the heavy fog. "Just listen. Walk away from the sound of the crashing ocean. Walk toward the silence of the land." I slowly turned my body in a full circle, closing my eyes, desperately trying to gauge the acoustics of the crashing ocean. But the thick fog horribly distorted the sound. The roar of the water seemed to be echoing from everywhere at once. It was an omnipresent, vibrating, low-frequency hum that seemed to rattle my teeth, offering absolutely no directional clues. I picked a direction that felt right, relying purely on blind, terrified instinct, and started speed-walking. The wet, packed sand crunched loudly and wetly under my heavy rubber boots. Crunch, squelch, crunch, squelch. I walked for 5 agonizing minutes, then 10 minutes. My heart began to hammer frantically against my ribs. I should have hit the dry, loose, powdery sand of the dunes by now, but the ground beneath my feet remained completely flat, packed, and wet. I realized with a sickening jolt of horror that I was either walking parallel to the shoreline or, infinitely worse, I had gotten turned around in the fog and was walking slightly angled back out toward the deep water of the open ocean. Then I noticed the water. The shallow, ankle-deep tidal pools I had been splashing through weren't stagnant anymore. The water inside them was actively moving. It was swirling rapidly, rushing past the ankles of my boots, pulling at the rubber. The tide had turned. The king tide was rushing back in, and it was coming in terrifyingly fast. Pure, unadulterated, blinding panic completely overrode any remaining rational thought. I broke into a heavy, desperate jog, my breathing becoming ragged and shallow, my chest heaving painfully against the freezing cold air. I swung my heavy flashlight frantically from side to side, desperate for any landmark, a massive rock formation, a familiar piece of bleached driftwood, any sign of the dunes. As the beam of my flashlight swept wildly to the right, the bright light caught something in the dense, swirling fog about 30 feet away. I skidded to a violent halt, my heavy boots slipping and sliding in the rapidly rising, freezing water. Standing perfectly still in the shallow, rushing tide, barely visible through the thick, shifting white vapor, was a silhouette. It was incredibly tall, easily over 6.5 feet, but it was hunched forward at a sickening, unnatural angle. It didn't look like a lost, wandering tourist. It didn't have the gear of a late-night fisherman. It was wearing something dark, heavy, and incredibly bulky, like thick, waterlogged rags or heavy, rotting kelp that draped heavily down from its shoulders, trailing into the swirling water. "Hey!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, raw desperation and hope clawing at my throat. "Hey! I'm turned around! I'm lost! Which way's the shore? Please, help me!" The deafening roar of the incoming ocean drowned out the tail end of my voice, but I know without a shadow of a doubt that the figure heard me. It didn't answer. It didn't wave a flashlight back. It didn't offer a single gesture of human comfort. Instead, it slowly, deliberately, and with horrifying mechanical stiffness, turned its hunched, massive body directly toward me.
Through the swirling, shifting fog, the flashlight beam couldn't illuminate any facial features. It was just a black, featureless void beneath a heavy, dripping, misshapen hood. But the way the entity moved was horrifying. It didn't step lightly like a human navigating water. It dragged itself. Its movements were heavy, jerky, and sickeningly asymmetrical, as if one side of its body was broken or paralyzed, dragging a massive dead weight through the rising tide. Splash, drag, splash, drag. It was moving directly toward me, and despite its broken, dragging gait, it was moving impossibly fast. Every single evolutionary survival instinct I possessed, passed down through thousands of years of human history, screamed at me to run. I didn't care about picking the right direction anymore. I turned exactly 180 degrees away from the horrifying figure and sprinted with every single ounce of physical strength I had left in my body, plunging blindly into the white wall of fog. The water was rising incredibly fast now, rushing in from the invisible trenches. It was already cresting over the tops of my heavy rubber boots, flooding them with freezing, paralyzing seawater, adding massive, exhausting anchor-like resistance to every single stride. The drag was absolute agony on my thighs and lungs. I constantly checked over my shoulder, pointing the beam of my flashlight blindly into the swirling fog behind me, praying the light would reflect off nothing. But the figure was keeping pace. I couldn't see its outline clearly anymore, swallowed by the mist, but I could hear it. Underneath the deafening, thunderous roar of the encroaching ocean, I could hear the heavy, violent, rhythmic splashing of something massive, something incredibly heavy, wading rapidly through the water, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. Splash, splash, splash. It wasn't a person. No human being on Earth could move that fast through knee-deep, freezing, resistant water with that kind of heavy, mechanical, dragging gait. It sounded like a machine tearing through the surf. "Help!" I screamed, sobbing uncontrollably now, tears freezing on my cheeks. My lungs were burning, feeling as though they were filled with crushed glass. I could taste metallic blood and heavy salt in the back of my throat from the intense physical exertion. The water was halfway up my calves. The current was growing stronger, threatening to sweep my legs out under me. I knew that if I fell, I wouldn't be able to stand back up. I was going to drown. I was going to collapse from pure exhaustion, and whatever was relentlessly chasing me through the fog was going to reach me, grab me, and drag me down into the freezing black abyss where I would never be found. Suddenly, my leading foot hit something soft, giving, and incredibly unstable. It wasn't wet, packed sand. It was dry, loose powder. I had hit the base of the dunes. I stumbled over my own exhausted feet, falling hard onto my hands and knees, burying my freezing, numb fingers deep into the loose, powdery sand of the upper embankment. I didn't stand up. I scrambled frantically forward on all fours, crawling like a terrified, wounded animal up the steep, 50-degree incline of the dune, tearing my fingernails on the sharp, buried roots of the seagrass, desperately pulling myself away from the water's edge. I reached the crest of the massive dune and collapsed entirely, rolling onto my back, gasping violently for air, my chest heaving, staring up at the dark, foggy sky. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the heavy metal cylinder of my maglite. I forced myself to roll over, shining the powerful beam down the steep, sandy embankment, directly toward the water's edge. The fog was still incredibly thick, swirling violently in the rising wind, but the ocean had returned. The massive, flat expanse of the sandbar was completely gone. The violent, churning whitecaps were already crashing violently against the very base of the dunes, completely swallowing the massive area I had just been trapped on mere minutes ago. The water had risen 10 feet in the span of my panicked sprint. I kept the beam of the flashlight trained aggressively on the churning water at the base of the dune for 10 agonizing, heart-stopping minutes, my entire body shaking uncontrollably with severe hypothermia and raw, unfiltered terror. Nothing came out of the water. Nothing crested the dune. The terrifying, heavy, dragging, splashing sounds had completely ceased, replaced only by the roar of the surf. I eventually found the physical strength to stand up on my trembling legs. I stumbled blindly through the sharp dune grass until I found the asphalt of the parking lot. I reached my Jeep, threw myself inside, slammed the door and locked it. I turned the heater on full blast, curled my knees to my chest, and just wept until I violently threw up in the passenger seat from the pure adrenaline dump. I never went to the police. What would I even tell them? That a patch of bad weather scared me? That the fog chased me? That a monster from the deep, wearing heavy rags, tried to grab me on a sandbar? They would have laughed me out of the station, or worse, committed me to a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold for hallucinations. But I am not crazy. I know exactly what I saw in that blinding fog. I know the distinct, heavy, wet sound of those unnatural footsteps splashing through the rising tide, hunting me. The ocean is massive, inexplored, ancient, and deeply alien. We sit on the beach with our coolers and pretend we understand what lives in it. But the terrifying truth is, we only know what it allows itself to be caught in our nets. And to this day, I refuse to walk on the beach when the sun goes down. Because I know that when the tide retreats, pulling back the curtain of the water, it sometimes leaves things behind that are incredibly patient, incredibly hungry, and just waiting for the thick sea fog to hide their approach.
Renting a private, isolated beach house sand sounds like the ultimate luxurious escape from reality. You get your own private, pristine stretch of sand, the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of the ocean lulling you to sleep every night, and the comforting, serene isolation of a secluded coastline far away from the stress of the city. But true isolation is a terrifying double-edged sword. When your nearest neighbor is 2 miles down a dark, unpaved road, and the constant, deafening roar of the crashing waves completely deafens you to the outside world, you are entirely, helplessly alone. You are living in a beautiful, fragile glass box on the edge of the world. If someone or something wants to get in, the ocean will ensure that absolutely no one is going to hear you scream. When I was 25, my fiancé Mark and I decided to take a much-needed week-long vacation to the Gulf Coast. We were both severely burned out from our demanding, high-stress corporate jobs and desperately wanted a quiet, romantic getaway where we didn't have to look at a screen or interact with a single other human being. We scoured the internet and found a listing for a beautiful, incredibly isolated modern beach house located on a remote, sparsely populated barrier island off the coast of Alabama. It was late September. Technically, this was the off-season, as the peak summer crowds had left and the threat of hurricane season kept the casual tourists away. Because of this, the rental price was an absolute steal, and the island was guaranteed to be completely devoid of people. The house itself was stunning, built in the classic, resilient Gulf Coast architectural style. To protect the main living areas from the devastating rising hurricane storm surges, the entire structure was elevated 15 feet off the sand, supported by massive, thick, chemically treated wooden pilings driven deep into the bedrock. You had to climb a steep 3-story set of exterior wooden stairs just to reach the front door. The space directly under the house was essentially a massive, shadowy, open-air carport with crushed white seashell driveway. This underbelly of the house was enclosed only by thin, decorative wooden latticework designed to hide the ugly plumbing pipes and the massive support pilings while allowing floodwaters to pass through harmlessly. We arrived late on a Monday afternoon, driving over the long concrete bridge connecting the island to the mainland. The house was even more gorgeous in person, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling, impact-resistant windows in the master bedroom that offered an unobstructed, breathtaking panoramic view of the dark, churning Gulf of Mexico. We spent the first 2 days in absolute idyllic bliss, drinking expensive wine on the massive, elevated wraparound deck, taking long, barefoot walks along the miles of completely empty beach, and truly enjoying the suffocatingly quiet, peaceful isolation. It felt like we owned the entire island. The horrifying reality of our vulnerable situation didn't start until Wednesday night. A severe, unseasonal tropical storm system had rapidly developed in the Gulf and rolled in toward the coast faster than the meteorologists had predicted. The sky turned a bruised, violent, sickly shade of purple, and the wind began to howl with terrifying, destructive force. It rattled the heavy metal hurricane shutters Mark had hastily pulled closed over the massive glass windows. The rain wasn't falling, it was lashing horizontally against the side of the house in blinding, heavy sheets, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the siding. Around 11 p.m., the power to the entire remote barrier island violently flickered, the lights dimming to a brownish-yellow hue before completely dying with a loud electrical pop from a distant transformer. The house was instantly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The sudden jarring silence from the dead refrigerator compressor and the central air conditioning unit was deafening. It was immediately replaced by the roaring, terrifying, omnipresent sound of the hurricane-force winds tearing relentlessly at the roof shingles and the thunderous, ground-shaking crashing of the massive, storm-fueled waves pounding the beach just 50 yards away. Mark and I were sitting on the couch in the dark living room, illuminated only by the weak, flickering golden light of 3 small emergency candles we had frantically dug out of the kitchen junk drawer. Without the AC, the temperature in the sealed house was already starting to rapidly rise, the thick, oppressive, salty coastal humidity seeping through the walls and settling over us like a heavy blanket. "Well, this is romantic," Mark joked nervously, wiping sweat from his forehead, desperately trying to lighten the heavy, incredibly anxious mood on the room. I offered a weak, unconvincing smile, wrapping a thin throw blanket tighter around my shoulders despite the stifling heat, purely for the psychological comfort. "I just hope the roof holds. It sounds like the wind is trying to rip the house right off the stilts." As if on cue, the wind momentarily died down, offering a brief, terrifying 5-second lull in the storm's deafening roar. In that pocket of silence, I heard a sound that made the blood in my veins run completely, paralyzingly ice cold. Scratch, scuff, drag. The sound wasn't coming from the roof above us. It wasn't coming from the heavy wind rattling the hurricane shutters on the walls. It was coming from directly beneath us, from under the hardwood floorboards. I froze completely, holding my breath, my eyes wide, staring blankly down at the wooden floor between my bare feet. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling violently, barely audible over the returning wind. Mark frowned, his brow furrowing in the candlelight. He leaned forward on the couch, straining his ears in the dark to listen. Hear what? It's just the wind, babe. The house is swaying on the stilts. The wood is just creaking. No, I insisted, my panic rising rapidly, my heart starting to pound. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy through the sand, right under the living room floor. We sat in absolute suffocating silence for 5 agonizing minutes, not daring to move, listening intently, trying to filter out the roar of the raging storm outside. Nothing, just the relentless wind and the pounding rain. It was probably just a piece of heavy debris blowing under the house, Mark reasoned, putting a warm, comforting hand on my trembling knee. A stray trash can blowing down the street, or a lawn chair from a neighbor's yard scraping against the pilings. Come on, let's just go to bed. There's nothing we can do out here in the dark. The power will probably be back on by morning. I reluctantly agreed, wanting to believe his logical explanation, though the tight, heavy knot of pure anxiety in my stomach refused to untighten. We grabbed a single candle and carefully, slowly navigated our way down the dark hallway to the master bedroom at the back of the house.
We climbed into bed, pulling the thin, sweat-dampened sheet up to our waists. The master bedroom was an addition to the original structure, situated directly over the deep, loose sand of the primary dunes, supported by the thickest, tallest wooden pilings. I lay wide awake in the suffocating dark, staring blindly at the black ceiling, my ears painfully straining to filter every single creak, groan, and shudder of the wooden house swaying in the gale-force winds. Mark, physically exhausted from a long day of swimming and fighting the storm prep, fell into a deep sleep within 20 minutes, his breathing becoming slow, heavy, and rhythmic beside me. At exactly 2:15 a.m., I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't the ambient sound of debris blowing in the wind. It was unmistakably, chillingly deliberate, and it was terrifyingly close. Scrape. Shh. Scrape. Shh. It was the distinct, rhythmic, methodical sound of something digging in the packed sand, and it was happening directly beneath our bed. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently and painfully, I honestly thought I was having a heart attack. The acoustic sound was incredibly clear, traveling up the wooden pilings and through the thin floorboards. Someone was underneath the house, in the pitch-black enclosed carport area, violently and purposefully digging a deep hole in the crushed shells and wet sand. I grabbed Mark's shoulder and violently shook him awake. "Mark, wake up! Mark, there is someone under the house!" I hissed, hot tears of pure, unadulterated terror welling in my eyes, spilling down my cheeks. Mark woke up groggy, disoriented in the dark, but the sheer raw panic in my voice instantly sobered him. He sat up quickly, rubbing his eyes, and in the faint ambient moonlight filtering through the tiny cracks in the metal hurricane shutters, I saw his expression shift from confusion to absolute dread. He didn't say a word. He slowly, silently slid from under the sheets. He crept over to his open canvas duffel bag on the floor and pulled out a heavy, high-lumen, black tactical flashlight he always brought on road trips. He looked back at me, put a finger to his lips, and motioned frantically with his hand for me to stay in the bed and remain absolutely silent. He tiptoed out of the bedroom, his bare feet making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. I sat alone in the dark bedroom, shivering uncontrollably despite the 80-degree heat, clutching the thin sheet tightly to my chest, completely paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt nauseating. I heard Mark slowly disengage the deadbolt and opened a heavy wooden front door, the violent wind immediately howling down the hallway into the living room. He was going out onto the elevated wraparound deck. He was going to lean over the wooden railing and look straight down through the thin wooden lattice into the dark and closed space beneath the house.
I waited in the bedroom for what felt like an absolute mind-breaking eternity. My mind raced with horrific, violent scenarios. Were we being robbed by opportunistic looters taking advantage of the blackout? Was it a violent, unstable drifter seeking shelter from the deadly storm surge? Or was it something infinitely worse, something that knew we were trapped on the island? 10 agonizing minutes passed. I heard nothing but the storm. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut. Mark burst back into the bedroom, slamming the bedroom door shut behind him and violently throwing the thumb lock. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his chest heaving up and down, his eyes wide and completely blown out with a level of pure terror I had never ever seen in him before. "Get your shoes on," he whispered frantically, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual calm depth. "What? Mark, what is it? What did you see?" I sobbed, frantically scrambling out of the tangled sheets and jamming my bare feet into my sneakers, completely ignoring the laces. "Don't ask questions. Don't turn on your phone flashlight. Just stay behind me and move as fast as you physically can."
"Come," he ordered, grabbing my arm in a vice-like, bruising grip. We practically ran through the dark, humid house, bumping into furniture. He unlocked the front door, threw it open, and we burst out into the driving, freezing horizontal rain. We sprinted recklessly down the steep, slippery 3-story wooden stairs leading to the driveway. We threw ourselves into our rental car. Mark jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. He threw the transmission into reverse and floored the accelerator. The car lurched backward out of the sandy, shell-crushed driveway, the tires spinning wildly, kicking up massive plumes of wet sand before finally catching hard traction on the paved island road. He drove dangerously fast through the blinding torrential storm, hydroplaning several times, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't say a single word until we crossed the massive 2-mile-long concrete bridge connecting the barrier island back to the mainland safety, completely leaving the dark, isolated beach behind us in the rearview mirror. He finally pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour mega gas station on the mainland, parking the car under the harsh, glaring white canopy lights. He killed the engine and slunked heavily over the steering wheel, his entire body trembling violently, completely overcome by adrenaline. "Mark, please, you are terrifying me," I cried, reaching out to touch his shaking shoulder. "What was under the house? Who was it?" He slowly sat up, took a deep, shuddering breath, and looked at me. His face was a mask of absolute, profound horror that will be burned into my memory forever. "I walked out onto the deck," he began, his voice barely a raspy whisper, his eyes staring blankly at the gas pumps. I leaned over the wooden railing and shined the tactical flashlight straight down through the wooden lattice into the carport area under the bedroom. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. There was a man under the house. He was completely naked. He was covered head to toe in wet gray mud and sand, like he had been rolling in it to camouflage himself. He had used a small hand trowel to dig a massive, shallow, grave-like trench directly beneath our bedroom, right in the center of the support pilings. My breath caught in my throat. I felt physically sick to my stomach, a wave of nausea washing over me. "But that wasn't the worst part, Amanda," continued Mark, his voice breaking completely, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "He wasn't trying to hide from the storm. He didn't have a sleeping bag. He had rigged something up. He had taken a long 10-foot piece of hollow PVC plumbing pipe he found under the house, and he had wedged it tightly, vertically between the sand in the trench and the wooden floorboards, directly, precisely beneath where our bed was sitting. I stared at him in absolute, uncomprehending, paralyzing horror. "He was using it like a stethoscope," whispered Mark, his voice trembling with disgust and terror. "When I shined the blinding light down on him, he was lying flat on his back in the wet dirt trench. He was pressing his ear tightly against the bottom opening of the PVC pipe, his eyes closed, just listening to us breathe in the dark.
We locked the car doors and called the mainland county police immediately from the gas station parking lot. Because the remote barrier island was connected by a single access bridge, they were able to send 2 heavily armed cruisers out through the storm right away. When the police arrived at the rental house with spotlights blazing, the naked man was gone, having slipped away into the vast shifting dunes during the raging storm, completely erasing his tracks in the heavy rain. But the police found the massive body-sized trench. They found the PVC pipe still wedged firmly against the floorboards directly under our mattress. But most horrifyingly, buried shallowly in the sand just a few feet from the trench, they found a small, black, waterproof duffel bag. Inside were heavy-duty industrial zip ties, a massive roll of silver duct tape, a razor-sharp serrated hunting knife, and a notebook filled with terrifyingly detailed, hand-drawn maps and architectural layouts of the rental property. The maps included the exact locations of the master bedroom, the floorboard weak points, and the schedules of when the motion sensor lights activated. He hadn't targeted us randomly. He hadn't just wandered out of the storm. He had been living in the deep dunes for days, watching the property through binoculars, waiting for the massive storm to hit and the power to inevitably go out so the security cameras and alarms would fail. He was listening to our movements through the floorboards, mapping our routines, waiting patiently for us to fall deeply asleep so he could find a way inside. We never went back to that house. We left all our clothes, our laptops, and our belongings behind, had a police escort take us to the airport the very next morning. The rental company was incredibly apologetic and tried to offer us a full refund and a free stay at a different property. But no amount of money can ever erase the profound, terrifying, skin-crawling violation of knowing that while we were sleeping in what we thought was an isolated, romantic paradise, a predator was lying in the dirt just inches beneath us, listening to every one of our heartbeats in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
The ocean is the ultimate, undisputed master of deception on this planet. It presents a beautiful, rhythmic, calming, sparkling surface that masks an environment of complete and utter violence, chaos, and death underneath. We are terrestrial, land-dwelling animals. We fundamentally do not belong in the deep water. In the ocean, we are slow, clumsy, completely devoid of our natural senses, and utterly blind in the dark, crushing depths. The apex predators that live in the ocean know this instinctively. And some of those predators, whether they have fins and gills or whether they are entirely human, have learned exactly how to weaponize our own innate empathy and heroism to drag us into an environment where we cannot possibly survive. I spent 4 intense, exhausting years working as a certified ocean rescue lifeguard in a highly populated, incredibly busy tourist town on the East Coast. My job was incredibly grueling and physically demanding. Long 12-hour shifts, staring into the blinding, blistering sun, maintaining constant, hyper-focused vigilance, and dealing with arrogant tourists who completely underestimated the deadly, invisible power of the rip currents that plagued our shores. I had pulled dozens of drowning, panicking people out of the surf. I knew the water, and I respected its power. But the real profound horror of the job didn't happen during my shifts surrounded by hundreds of people. It happened on my days off, when the beaches were supposedly closed and empty. It was late August, the very tail end of the chaotic tourist season. The weather was still incredibly warm and humid, but the massive crowds had thinned out significantly as families packed up and kids went back to school. I lived alone in a small, cramped, third-floor apartment about 3 blocks off the main beach drag. It was a Thursday night around 2 a.m. I was suffering from a terrible, relentless bout of insomnia,
tossing and turning in the stifling, suffocating heat of my unair-conditioned bedroom, the ceiling fan doing nothing but pushing hot air around. Completely unable to sleep and feeling restless, I decided to go for a hard run on the beach to physically exhaust myself. I threw on a pair of lightweight running shorts, a dark sweat-wicking t-shirt, and my running shoes, and jogged the 3 dark blocks down to the shoreline. The beach was completely, utterly deserted. The massive, towering wooden lifeguard stands, which I manned and commanded during the day, now stood like skeletal, ominous, silent sentinels in the dark, casting long, eerie, distorted shadows across the packed sand. The moon was mostly obscured by thick, fast-moving heavy clouds, plunging the coastline into near-total darkness. The only ambient light came from the distant, faint, hazy glow of the boardwalk hotels miles down the northern coast. I started my run, keeping a steady, rhythmic, pounding pace along the hard-packed, wet sand right where the waves receded. The rhythmic sound of my own heavy breathing and the relentless, thunderous crashing of the surf were the only noises for miles. I ran for about 45 minutes, heading far south, leaving the populated town center far behind, moving toward a long, desolate, unpatrolled stretch of rocky coastline known locally as the Jetties. This specific area was notoriously deadly even in broad daylight. The underwater currents moving around the massive, man-made rock formations were entirely unpredictable, and the sharp, jagged, submerged rocks created deadly, swirling undertows that could pull a strong swimmer down in seconds. Swimming there was strictly, legally prohibited, and we never set up lifeguard stands near it. As I approached the dark, imposing, jagged outline of the massive stone jetties extending out into the violent black water, my lungs were burning. I slowed my pace to a walk, catching my breath, resting my hands on my knees, staring out at the ocean. I looked out at the churning water, staring blankly into the pitch-black void, mesmerizing myself with the whitecaps. Suddenly, my lifeguard instincts, honed by hundreds of hours of scanning the horizon for distress signals, caught a sharp, distinct flash of light. I snapped my head up instantly, my adrenaline spiking, squinting hard into the darkness, wiping my sweat from my eyes. About 60 yards out, floating in the deep, violent, churning black water well past the chaotic breaker line, was a small, intense, piercing red light. It flashed once, twice, then went completely dark, swallowed by the blackness. I stood up straight, staring intently at the water, my heart rate quickening, my breathing stopping. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds later, it flashed again. 2 rapid, desperate, strobe-like bursts of brilliant, blinding red light. My blood ran completely cold. All the heat from my run vanished. I knew exactly, precisely what that specific light was. It was a marine emergency strobe, the highly expensive, water-activated strobe attached to high-end offshore life vests or waterproof personal locator beacons used by deep-sea boaters or night divers in extreme distress. Someone was out there. Someone was in the water, in the middle of the night, in a strictly prohibited, incredibly dangerous area, plagued with a massive undertow, and they were actively, desperately signaling for help. "Hey!" I screamed at the absolute top of my lungs, cupping my hands around my mouth, my voice tearing through the roaring wind. The red light flashed again in immediate response to my voice. It was bobbing erratically, rising and falling violently in the swells, as if the person holding it was struggling violently to keep their head above the heavy, crashing waves. I did a rapid, frantic mental calculus. I didn't have my red rescue buoy. I didn't have a waterproof radio to call the station. I didn't even have my cell phone in my pocket to call the Coast Guard or 111. I was completely, entirely alone on a dark beach, miles from help.
But the deeply ingrained primal instinct and rigorous training of a first responder completely overrode my rational, logical fear of the dark, deadly water. If I ran the 2 miles back to town to find a phone and get help, whoever was out there would drown, their lungs filling with seawater, long before a rescue boat even launched. I had no choice. I had to go in and stabilize them. I kicked off my heavy running shoes, stripped off my t-shirt to reduce drag, and sprinted full speed, hitting the water with immense force, diving directly into the freezing, churning surf. The water hit me like a physical, icy wall. It was paralyzingly cold, shocking my system. The waves were brutal, crashing violently against my chest, knocking me backward, filling my nose with stinging salt. I fought through the chaotic break line, diving deep under the massive, cresting walls of whitewater, using all my strength, swimming furiously, executing a perfect front crawl directly toward the flashing red light. The darkness out past the breakers was absolute, disorienting, and suffocating. Once I passed the whitewater, the open ocean swelled massively around me, lifting me high on the crests of waves and dropping me sickeningly deep into dark, terrifying troughs where I couldn't see the horizon, the beach, or anything but towering walls of black water on all sides. "Keep flashing the light! Keep it up!" I roared over the deafening sound of the ocean, spitting bitter salt water from my mouth, my arms and shoulders already burning fiercely from the intense, desperate exertion. The light flashed again. It was closer now, much closer, maybe 30 yards away, bobbing in the trough of a massive swell. I swam harder, pushing through the brutal, numbing cold, my eyes locked on the exact spot where the red strobe had last appeared, ignoring the terrifying depth beneath my kicking legs. "I'm coming! I'm a lifeguard! Keep your head up!" I yelled, treading water frantically as I crested a massive swell, kicking hard to keep my head above the churning surface. I waited for the light to flash again so I could pinpoint their exact location and make physical contact. I waited, treading water. 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The red light didn't flash. The ocean was completely, terrifyingly, uniformly pitch black. "Hey, flash the light!" I screamed, genuine, rising panic beginning to set in. Had they dropped it? "Where are you? Yell for me!" Silence. Absolute silence, save for the roar of the water and the howling wind. No coughing, no thrashing, no cries for help. I was treading water in the deep, violent ocean, completely blind, exhausting my precious energy rapidly. Had they gone under? Had the undertow dragged them down? Had the beacon's battery failed? I spun around in a desperate, frantic 360-degree circle, searching the dark, rolling swells for any sign of a person, any reflection of moonlight on a bright orange life vest, any disruption in the water. Nothing. I was entirely, helplessly alone in the vast, deep, churning abyss. Then I felt something that completely shattered my entire perception of reality, broke my professional composure, and plunged me into an absolute, unadulterated, primal horror. Something brushed gently against my bare right leg, deep underwater. It wasn't a slimy piece of drifting seaweed. It wasn't the slick, scaly side of a passing fish. It was a human hand. I felt long, distinct, freezing cold fingers wrap lightly, deliberately around my calf for a fraction of a second, feeling the tense, kicking muscle before pulling away, smoothly, silently into the dark water. I froze completely. I stopped kicking. My lungs seized, refusing to take in air.
My heart pounded so violently I felt it vibrating in my teeth. Someone was in the water with me, directly beneath me, in the pitch-black, freezing depths. And they weren't drowning. They weren't thrashing or panicking. They were swimming with absolute, silent, calculated, predatory grace. The horrifying realization hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. The red light wasn't a boater in distress. It wasn't an emergency beacon marking a drowning victim. It was a lure.
Some deeply psychotic, deranged individual had swum out into the deadly, freezing current in the middle of the night, treading water silently in the dark. They were flashing a distress strobe, specifically waiting for a good Samaritan on the empty beach to see it, panic, drop their board, and willingly swim out into the deep, hostile water to save them. They were hunting, and I had swum right into their trap, completely exhausting myself to get there. "Oh my God," I whispered, pure, suffocating terror choking my voice, salt water entering my mouth. I didn't dive down to look. I didn't try to tread water and fight. I turned my body frantically toward the faint, barely visible, dark silhouette of the distant shoreline and began swimming with an intensity, desperation, and raw fear I have never experienced before or since. I abandoned all my professional training. I swam with a frantic, uncoordinated, terrifying speed, violently thrashing my arms and legs, slapping the water, desperate to propel myself away from whatever was floating silently beneath me. Every single second, I expected to feel a massive, violent, inescapable yank on my ankle. I expected to be dragged violently down into the freezing black depths where my lungs would fill with water and no one on earth would ever hear my screams. Every time a wave crashed over my head, pushing me under the surface into the blackness, I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, absolutely terrified I would open them and see a pale, smiling face staring back at me in the dark water, reaching for my throat. I swam until my muscles screamed in agonizing pain, until they felt like lead, until I thought my heart was going to physically explode and burst through my ribcage. Finally, miraculously, my thrashing hand scraped against the hard, coarse, shifting sand of the shallow bottom. I scrambled to my feet in the waist-deep water, completely losing my balance, falling forward and dragging my exhausted, trembling, bruised body out of the violent surf onto the dry, packed sand of the beach. I collapsed onto my back on the sand, gasping violently for air, coughing uncontrollably, vomiting a mixture of stomach acid and seawater onto the sand beside me, staring blindly up at the dark, cloudy sky, my entire body shaking with shock. After a few minutes, I slowly, painfully pushed myself up onto my trembling elbows and looked back out at the pitch-black ocean. About 30 yards out, just past the massive, crashing breaker line, in the exact spot I had been treading water, the red light flashed again. Once. Twice. It was perfectly still, bobbing gently, rhythmically in the violent surf. Whoever was holding it was out there, treading water effortlessly in the dark, watching my exhausted body on the beach. They were flashing the light to let me know that they were still out there, letting me know that they had almost had me and that they had let me go. Then the red light went dark, and it didn't flash again. I scrambled to my feet, didn't bother grabbing my shoes or my shirt, and sprinted the 2 miles back to town barefoot on the asphalt, never once looking back over my shoulder at the water. I walked into the lifeguard captain's office the very next morning, handed in my whistle and my trunks, and quit the beach patrol effective immediately. I broke my lease, packed up my apartment, and moved 3 states inland, as far away from the coast as I could get. I couldn't look at the ocean, not even in broad daylight, without experiencing a severe, crippling, suffocating panic attack. The local police, when I filed a frantic report, thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion and insomnia. They patronizingly told me it was probably just a loose crab pot buoy with a malfunctioning navigation light that had broken loose from its moorings and was bouncing in the surf. But buoys don't have hands. Buoys don't have fingers that reach out and gently, deliberately touch your bare leg in the pitch-black water to see if you're close enough to grab and drag under. I know the truth. I know that out there, in the dark, freezing, unexplored depths off the coast, there are people who use the vast, isolating anonymity and the deadly power of the ocean to do horrific, unspeakable things. And they know exactly how to use your own humanity, your own desire to help others, to drag you down into the dark with them.